I have two very different questions. The first one, I would be interested in what became of Kurt von Malsan. And second, quite different, is it's not just in Britain that geopolitics has had quite a bad name. In Germany, it had and still has, in many ways, a very bad name. I would be interested in how you see the current situation. Is this changing in Britain at all? Is it turning into an accepted field of debate, so to speak, again, or not?
Yeah. First question, on what happened to Kurt von Malsan, I don't know, maybe somebody can tell me. He writes, I mean, he you know, if anything, just as Corbett is a propagandist for Fischer, Malsan is seen as the propagandist for Tirpitz. But I don't know what happens during the war. I should have asked Mika Luckenhans this morning. He would have told me the answer to that question. Does anyone else know what happened to Malsan? He certainly doesn't occupy a senior position during the war, and I'm just wondering when he does. I don't know. Short answer. On the second question, the fate of geopolitics, it suffers in Britain for exactly the same reasons it suffers in Germany. I mean, Haushofer, it really carries an enormous burden. I mean, Haushofer, after all, as a geopolitician, establishes his reputation on the Third Reich, not just as a geopolitician, but as a senior academic figure. I mean, and so when he falls, and when higher education in Germany is discredited because of its association with the regime, then geopolitics is a casualty of the same, and you know, is evidence really of the militarization, if you like, of geography as a subject. Interestingly, I mean, in Oxford, Mackinder, although he's an Oxford product and was reading geography in Oxford, and actually established the School of Geography in Oxford, Mackinder is a forgotten field. I mean, geopolitics is not discussed in the School of Geography. Although I have to say, the reason that I first read his lecture and became involved in this discussion was principally because I went to Oxford, because there is a body called the Mackinder Forum, and this may be part of the answer to your question. Because I found that as Professor of the History of War, I was on the committee for this, so I suddenly had to think, what's this about? I have no idea what this is about, so I read the lecture. And the drivers primarily come through strategic studies. Colin Gray at Reading University in particular is concerned about it. A man called Jeff Sloan, who's also now at Reading University, is very interested in geopolitics. And it's the people that they principally talk to are in the United States, where it has, that's where it really took hold, particularly during the Second World War and in the immediate aftermath. In 1943, a seminar at Princeton, run by a man called Edward Mead Earle, looked at the history of strategic thought. And there is a chapter in there on geopolitics. It doesn't well, it mentions Mackinder's lecture, but the real focus of that chapter is Haushofer. Geopolitics was taken seriously by Roosevelt, was taken seriously after the Second World War. A man called Spikeman was very influential in the United States. And it still seems to be part of American debate about strategy. The other country that has an interest in it is France, and they see it too within the context of strategic studies, that geopolitics is there. But I can't say that in Britain any more than in Germany there is a school of geopolitics. Question?
Could you tell us something about dual submarines? Because you did mention submarines at all, and this was the reason why the United States entered both.
When Mackinder's right, I mean, when Mackinder's writing, the submarine, of course, is an unproven technology. By 1914, there will be people, including Fisher, British First Sea Law, who would say that submarines will provide an effective counter to dreadnoughts, to major battleships. The real problems, of course, in 1914 is the submarine still goes, when it's submerged, goes so much slower than a surface ship that actually it's not a serious threat. to a warship that is sensibly, keeps up a sensible speed, goes on an unpredictable course. It's only likely to be effective, therefore, in a defensive battle. What Fisher's imagining in 1914 is if there were a German invasion of Britain, that the submarine might have a role in coastal waters, sinking German surface ships. Of course, what the submarine does in 1917, particularly of course its role in bringing the United States into the war, is raise for Germany the question of if it is to exercise maritime power, if that is a serious question, then what it should be investing in is submarines rather than surface ships. And the big question you would have thought after the First World War is that that has the capacity to change the geopolitical balance. Because if a land power can get a sufficient fleet of submarines together to challenge the power that controls the sea lines of communication, then a land power might be able to undermine the principles of maritime and sea power. And in a way, of course, for Britain, this is the same question as what previous generations have called a gale of course, the idea that a control of the sea could be challenged by harassing, raiding ships, cruisers, which would be surface vessels, of course, armoured merchantmen and so on, but then more effectively by submarines. Why doesn't that happen? Well, the answer in part, of course, is that in the 1920s, all navies concluded that this had been a one-off, that the challenge produced by German U-boat warfare, particularly in 1917, was not going to be repeated. They exaggerated the capacity of particularly sonar detection systems to be able to track submarines, and concluded the submarine would not be a major threat to the next war. What that suggests is that in terms of the clash, if you like, between the heartland and the rimland, that rather than look at the battles on the eastern front for Germany, that the real focus is the U-boat campaign of 1917-18 and the Battle of the Atlantic between 1940 and 43. And in both those battles, of course, ultimately, the prevailing sea power wins, that is to say, Britain wins against Germany. But you could argue, of course, the reason they did so was that in both the preparations of both those, Germany had not put sufficient priority into U-boats. That U-boats had been neglected. I mean, in 1917, the decision to go to unrestricted U-boat warfare is made at the point where Germany still hasn't built enough U-boats to be able to sustain an effective campaign. And although when Hitler abandons the Z plan, there is a proposal to create a larger number of U-boats, U-boat construction really continues to lag behind where the aspirations of U-boat warfare would place them, until relatively late in the Battle of the Atlantic. And by that time, the United States is in the war. So I think by the time the United States is in the war, it has a shipbuilding capacity which vastly exceeds the U-boat capacity to sink submarines, sink surface vessels, then actually the battle is going to be won. Of course, where the U-boat submarine really has an effect actually is in the Battle of the Pacific, because it is used to devastating effect to isolate Japan. It's the American submarine campaign in the Pacific which really has an effect on an already weak economy.
Any more questions? Not, yeah.
Just briefly, you mentioned just towards the end that like 90% of the world's trade is done by sea. Does like new technologies like I suppose then the submarine, but now like drones and things like this, can they affect like the worthiness of having a strong naval fleet? I mean, if you can no longer protect shipping by having ships nearby, is it still worthwhile investing? Any worthwhile investment?
What is extraordinary about this question is that nobody seriously discusses it, which they should, clearly. I mean, that figure, 90% of the world's trade goes by sea, is the figure he had trotted out by the Royal Navy year in, year out to explain why Britain continues to have a Royal Navy. When you actually say to them, what are you doing about protecting maritime trade? The short answer is very little. There is almost no discussion, and of course it's very hard for any one sovereign power to engage with the shipping business at the moment, because so many ships trade under flags of convenience and are registered in other ports than the ports of ownership. So, you know, I say this with some feeling, because as it happens, my father was a ship owner. And in the 1950s, he used to go to a committee where effectively they planned how, if the Cold War would become hot, how they would repeat the Battle of the Atlantic, how would they maintain convoys against the Soviet submarine threat, and how would the escorts be arranged, and all sorts of questions that people had to address in the 1940s. None of that goes on today. Now, what would happen? Would they be vulnerable to UAVs? Of course, there's no reason why a merchant ship shouldn't be vulnerable to UAV. Is it being addressed? Not that I'm aware of. I mean, I think it's part of the problem that we've acquired UAVs, or we are acquiring UAVs, or we're involved in the acquisition of UAVs, without actually thinking through what the strategic implications are. You know, all that can be seen is they're being used to target Taliban leaders in Pakistan, and that is where the focus lies, rather than some of the other applications. The real issue that I think the UAV raises is the intelligence picture. And so if I can relate this to what I've just been saying, the big challenge in attacking maritime trade in war, unless you're going to sink everything, which is obviously what effectively happens in both world wars, the big challenge in maritime trade in both world wars is, what ship are you looking at? What is it carrying? Who owns it? Where's it going? You see a merchant ship in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, particularly today, because it might be flying a flag that doesn't actually reflect its national ownership. You don't necessarily know, apart from the direction it's pointing in, where it might be going. You don't know what cargo it is, just by looking at it. I mean, obviously, if it's a bulk carrier, so if it's carrying oil or it's carrying liquid gas or something like that, you might be able to recognise that, as opposed to dry cargo. But you don't know what it's carrying. And that's the problem in the First World War for the British blockade. They're trying to stop goods getting into Germany. If you sink too many neutral ships carrying cargo that's probably not contraband, that's not going to be very good for British diplomacy or for international relations. You need to be more precise. So you need a great deal of commercial intelligence before you can begin to operate an economic war of that sort effectively. And I would say that in the advent of any war, that would actually be the real issue. How, assuming you're dealing with an interstate war, how could you actually exercise economic war effectively without creating an international crisis? You'd almost certainly end up attacking a neutral ship carrying a cargo that was getting to a neutral power that was not for on transshipment to a belligerent power. And I don't really know. And I think it will take some time before that commercial intelligence was put together. And it was an incredibly complicated task in the First World War. It will be even more complicated now, I would guess, to put that intelligence together. Which is not an answer to your question, because ultimately, indeed, a merchant ship will remain vulnerable to UAV. But actually, how you use that UAV will be the question.
May I ask a question that connects to the colleague's question on the submarines?
Yeah.
What's about airplanes and missiles? When did these new war technologies transcend this juxtaposition of sea power and land power?
Yeah, yeah.
And I think in connection with your talk, this has two aspects. First of all, was it a problem for geopolitics? And second, what's the consequences for Britain, which regards herself as a sea power?
Sure. Well, the answer is it happens between the two world wars, and it has a massive geopolitical context. And Britain wakes up to the possibility, even before the First World War, with the airship. I mean, they see the possibility that if a major hostile power controlled the Low Countries, controlled the Netherlands and Belgium, that then airships could be flown across the channel and attack Britain directly.
self-evidently, that has become true for 1940 for the manned aircraft, which is one of the reasons, of course, why the battle for France and Belgium in 1940 is so important to Britain. And equally, why, once Germany has control of Norway, as von Treuter put it, from the, I can't remember his phrase, from the North Cape to wherever, but anyway, said it from Norway, effectively, with Germany in control of the European coastline, from Norway to to the Havre. What that means is not just that Germany can use that as bases for U-boats and for surface raiders, but also Germany can use it for flying aircraft from. And they have a shorter distance to fly, self-evidently, than they would have from Germany. Now, it's, in those days, of course, bombers, particularly two-engine bombers, which is all Germany has, as opposed to four-engine bombers, will have a very limited bomb load and a limited range. So actually Germany has to be in France in order to be able to strike Britain effectively in France and France. By 1945, when Britain is bombing Germany, four-engine bombers can fly from Britain, of course, and reach Berlin in order to Dresden, in order to hit targets. So absolutely, it makes a geopolitical difference. The point would be that it makes a difference in war. I think the significant issue that Mackinder is raising is this notion that strategy also applies at peace. What he's talking about is the transference of power, which is economic as well as military. And the point that trade is still carried predominantly by sea rather than by air, however important air traffic is to us now, and however economically significant, still doesn't get over the issue that most of the world's goods are still traveling by sea. Now those ships are, just as they're vulnerable to UAVs today, of course become vulnerable to air attack in the Second World War. But actually within a relatively limited radius. I mean, it's only as the Atlantic convoys are crossing in the Second World War, the capacity of German aircraft to attack is, I can't remember what the mileage is, and there may be experts here, but given the fact you've got to fly back from Europe as well as fly out into the Atlantic, we're talking 200 or 300 miles rather than a much greater distance in order to allow for the return journey. So the points of vulnerability to air attack are in places like the Channel rather than say off the west coast of Britain. And when that changes dramatically, of course, will be as you get more long-range aircraft, and that changes. So it has changed since 1945, but we haven't yet learned to live with the military consequences of it. And these, it comes back to the question about UAVs. There are fundamental issues here about maritime strategy to do with air power, which we haven't yet directly experienced.
Okay. Thank you very much, Hew Strachan, for your lecture and for this very fruitful stopover in Berlin.
Thank you.
And I think we should give him a warm hand. For continuing this discussion in front of these doors, there is some reception prepared. Do you want to say?
No, just thank you very much, and do you have a glass of wine?
Okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you for being prepared to be exposed to those new issues. I think
there was one point in my
Yes.
It turned out that this was a very interesting affair in Britain, and that it was
glaring people. Someone might just think, 10-year-old Yes, I do, very much. It strikes me as just being very It's true.